You're too old for romance. That's what my daughter-in-law told me with a smirk tugging at her painted lips, as if she had just declared an unshakable truth of the universe. She said it lightly, almost like a joke, but her eyes never left my face. She wanted the words to sting, and they did. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. The dishes still smelled faintly of garlic and herbs, the kind of meal I had cooked hundreds of times over the decades, though she rarely lifted a hand to help clean. My husband sat across from us, pretending to scroll on his phone, though I could see the corners of his mouth twitch. He wasn't going to defend me. He never did, not when she spoke like that. I remember folding my napkin slowly, carefully, like I could smooth away the heat rising to my cheeks. My daughter-in-law leaned back on the couch, crossing her legs with that casual superiority she had perfected, her designer shoes dangling off one foot. "Some things are best left to the young," she added, raising her glass of wine. "Don't you think, Mom?" She calls me Mom in public to keep appearances, but in private her tone strips the word of any warmth. Tonight it felt more like a slap. My mind should have been quick enough to answer, to fire back with something clever, but nothing came. Silence clamped down around me, heavy and humiliating. I caught my husband's glance, but he ducked his head and busied himself with his phone again. He would rather disappear into a glowing screen than confront the cruelty sitting in our living room. So I sat there, swallowing the words I wished I could fling back. I let the insult settle, a bitter seed in my chest. At my age, people like her think the world has already passed me by. They think I am invisible, or worse, irrelevant. That night, she decided to declare me too old for love itself, as though affection and desire were privileges stamped with an expiration date. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was how deep those words would run, and how silently they would root themselves. I didn't argue with her. I didn't fight. I only folded my napkin one more time, smoothed it flat, and placed it neatly on the table. Inside, though, something stirred. A quiet spark. It wasn't rage, not yet. It wasn't even grief. It was the stillness you feel right before a storm, the kind that builds far out at sea. You can't see it, not yet, but you can feel it waiting. I held my tongue that night, because I've lived long enough to know the power of silence. Words once spoken can be dismissed as pettiness. Silence, on the other hand, unsettles. It lingers. It waits. When she drained her wine glass and laughed at her own joke, I simply rose and carried my plate to the sink. My back was straight. My face gave nothing away. I knew she thought she'd won. But as I rinsed the dishes under the warm water, her words replayed in my mind, over and over. Too old for romance. I thought of the girl I once was, walking down the aisle in a handmade dress, trembling with nerves but glowing with hope. I thought of the years of laughter, of arguments, of reconciliations, of the small hand of a child wrapped around mine, of my own body carrying life, enduring pain, still soft enough for comfort. Romance isn't just candlelight and roses. It's devotion. It's presence. It's the strength to remain when storms come. And yet, here I was, treated like a relic. The insult should have broken me. Instead, it held a mirror up to something I had been refusing to see. I turned off the faucet, set the plate on the rack, and dried my hands slowly. Behind me, she and my husband were laughing about some television show, their voices blurred into noise. That's when I felt it fully, the seed of resistance taking root. I didn't answer her that night. I let her have her moment, her superiority. But I also knew, deep down, that silence wasn't surrender. It was the first step. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring. I was listening. To myself. And though she couldn't see it, though even my husband didn't notice, something in me had shifted. Her words had opened a door she would come to regret. I suppose I should tell you who I am, so you understand why her words cut as deeply as they did. My name is Margaret, and I am 68 years old. I spent most of my life as a school teacher, the kind who remembered birthdays and slipped extra cookies into lunchboxes when a child looked hungry. I wasn't glamorous, never ambitious for titles or recognition. I wanted a home, a marriage that lasted, children who felt safe. That was enough for me. When I married my husband, Charles, I believed in forever. I believed that devotion and patience could weather anything. I followed him when his work demanded relocation. I took on extra tutoring jobs when money was thin, and when his business started to grow, I stepped back to raise the children and manage the house. I was proud to make sacrifices because I believed they were for us, for our family. In time, our children grew, moved out, started families of their own. I welcomed their spouses warmly, determined not to be one of those mothers-in-law who clung too tightly or turned critical. When Daniel, our youngest, brought home his new wife, her name is Vanessa, I greeted her with open arms. She was pretty, quick with compliments, and I thought she had a kind of spark that would be good for him. I told myself she would become a daughter to me. But warmth, I soon learned, was not what she was looking for. The early slights came like pinpricks, small, almost dismissible, except that each one left a sting. She would correct me in front of others, as if she were the authority and I were the child. Once at a dinner party, I set out the silver serving spoon, and she announced, with a laugh loud enough for everyone to hear, that Margaret still believes silver makes food taste special. The room chuckled politely, but I burned inside. Or the time she walked into my kitchen wearing her high heels and perfume in the middle of Sunday cooking, peered into the pot of stew I had been preparing since morning, and wrinkled her nose. "So, traditional," she said, a word that in her mouth meant outdated, unnecessary. My husband laughed along with her, though he had eaten that same stew lovingly for 40 years. She called my wardrobe old-fashioned. She teased that I was sweet but out of touch. She rolled her eyes when I offered advice about Daniel's work or health, like wisdom earned over decades could be tossed aside like a worn-out shoe. And I stayed quiet, because that's who I am, or at least who I was. I believed keeping the peace was more important than winning small battles. I believed a home survived on restraint. But beneath that quiet, a tally was forming. Every dismissal, every smirk, every laugh at my expense, they collected inside me like stones dropped into a jar. There were moments, though, when her mask slipped, and I saw something sharper in her eyes, a hunger for attention, for control. When guests were over, she always steered the conversation toward herself, her new clothes, her expensive dinners, her travels. She liked the spotlight. And if she had to push me deeper into the shadows to claim it, she didn't hesitate. Charles noticed, of course, but his way was to shrug things off. "She's young," he'd say. "Don't take it so seriously. Times are different now." Different. That word excused so much, so I pressed my lips together and endured. I told myself I had survived bigger storms, childbirth, financial hardship, the sudden death of my mother. What was a few sharp words from a young woman who thought the world revolved around her? And yet, it was more than words. It was the steady erasure of me. I had given decades to building this family, pouring my energy into making sure everyone else thrived. And now, here was this daughter-in-law who treated me like a relic in my own home, who believed my age had stripped me of all claim to respect, or worse, to love. Looking back, I can see how her arrogance was always there, hiding beneath polite smiles, but at the time I convinced myself it wasn't worth the fight. I chose silence over confrontation, not realizing that silence was exactly what gave her permission to grow bolder. Still, I endured, because that's what women of my generation do, isn't it? We endure. We tell ourselves that our value lies in keeping families together, in swallowing pride so that others might remain comfortable. But a person can only endure for so long before something snaps. And the night she told me I was too old for romance, I felt the weight of every past insult pressing down. It wasn't just her words in that moment. It was the entire history of her dismissals, her contempt, her smug belief that I had nothing left to offer. She thought she had humiliated me with one clever line. What she didn't realize was that she had just laid bare the truth I had been avoiding. I was not respected, not by her, and not by the man who should have defended me. And once I finally allowed myself to see that truth, there was no unseeing it. It began with whispers of unease, the kind that creep into your stomach before your mind has the courage to name them. I started noticing how Vanessa lingered too long when she spoke to Charles. At first I thought I was imagining it. She would laugh. Oh, how she laughed. Her hand brushing his arm as though it was the most natural thing in the world. A touch here, a glance there, all veiled as harmless affection. But women my age know better. We've lived long enough to sense what lies beneath a smile. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen carrying a basket of folded laundry. I froze in the doorway. Vanessa stood close, far too close to Charles as he leaned against the counter. She was slicing a lemon for her drink, her fingers grazing his hand as she offered him a wedge. He chuckled, a low, nervous sound, the way a boy might when caught in mischief. They both turned at once when they noticed me, and in that instant their eyes told me everything. Hers, defiant and daring, as if challenging me to protest. His, guilty, sheepish, avoiding mine altogether. I placed the basket on the table without a word and walked out. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I could hear nothing else. For days after, I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was harmless, I told myself. Perhaps I was reading too much into gestures. But the unease would not leave me. It gnawed at me in the quiet of the night, in the stillness of early morning when Charles rolled away from me in bed, claiming exhaustion. The confirmation came not long after. I had grown wary of how often Vanessa's phone buzzed when she visited, how quickly she swiped the screen and tucked it away. One evening, after they left the living room to fetch something from the garage, her phone buzzed again on the coffee table. I shouldn't have looked. I told myself that for years, that prying was beneath me, that trust was sacred. But something stronger guided my hand that night. I picked it up, and there it was. A string of messages between her and Charles. Not explicit, not yet. But the words dripped with an intimacy that had no place between a man and his son's wife. Dinner was wonderful tonight. You looked radiant. I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. You understand me better than anyone else does. My breath caught. My knees trembled. I set the phone back down carefully as though it might explode in my hand and sat there staring at the wall. I could hear their laughter drifting from the garage, casual, comfortable. My own house echoed with betrayal. There was no denying it anymore, no pretending it was harmless, no comfort left in self-deception. The truth was naked now, stripped of disguise. My daughter-in-law was flirting with my husband, and he welcomed it. I thought back to all the sacrifices I had made for this family, the years I had spent being the steady one, the constant, the keeper of traditions and the glue that held it all together. And for what? To sit in my own living room and watch my son's wife bat her eyelashes at the man I had built my life beside? To discover words meant only for me now, whispered into her phone? My heart didn't just ache, it fractured. A dull, spreading ache that pressed into my ribs and made it hard to breathe. But amid the pain, something else stirred, something sharp. I could no longer cling to denial. The curtain had been torn away, and I saw the stage clearly now. They were actors in a play I had not agreed to, using my home, my history as their backdrop. I stood in the kitchen later that night, staring out at the garden Charles and I had tended together for years. The roses, now dormant in winter, waited patiently for spring. They would bloom again because that's what they were made to do. I realized then that I too had a choice, to wither in silence or to prepare for my own season of reckoning. I closed the curtain, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs with a steady step. The time for denial was gone. The truth had arrived, and it refused to leave quietly. Nights became the hardest. When the house was quiet and Charles had turned his back to me in bed, I would lie staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. That sound had once comforted me. For decades, it meant companionship, safety, the reassurance that I wasn't alone in the world. Now, it felt like betrayal played on a loop beside me. I tried to speak to him once, to pierce through the silence. "Charles," I whispered, "are you happy?" He shifted, muttered something about being tired, and pulled the blanket higher over his shoulder. Conversation ended. He had no intention of opening the door I was knocking on. That was when the isolation seeped in. I was alone in a marriage I had built brick by brick with my own 2 hands, alone in a house whose walls echoed with memories of birthdays, holidays, and late-night laughter. The very space that should have been my sanctuary now felt like a stage where I played the role of the unwanted extra. There is a numbness that comes with heartbreak, a strange hollowness in the chest, as though your heart has gone missing and left only an echo behind. I felt that numbness most mornings, when I poured coffee into Charles's cup and he barely looked up from his phone. I felt it when Vanessa pranced in, wearing her perfume too strong, her laughter too loud, her hand brushing his arm in front of me as though I were invisible. Invisible. That word lodged deep. Because invisibility is a kind of death, isn't it? To still breathe, still move, but to no longer matter in the eyes of the ones you love. For a while, I let that invisibility consume me. I moved through the days quietly, performing routines out of habit rather than joy. Laundry, cooking, tidying. I watched them carry on and I disappeared into the background like old wallpaper no one bothers to peel away. But in that silence, something unexpected began to form. It came to me one evening when I was sitting alone in the den, the television humming in the background. I had been flipping through an old photo album, my hands tracing the edges of pictures where my smile was unguarded, where Charles's arm rested around my shoulders proudly. For a moment, grief overwhelmed me. Grief for the woman I once was, for the marriage I thought I had, for the respect I assumed I'd earned. Tears spilled before I could stop them. And then, in the midst of that storm, a thought rose clear as a bell. I refused to remain small. It startled me. How fierce it sounded inside my head. I sat up straighter, wiped my cheeks, and said it aloud to the empty room. I refuse to remain small. It was the breaking point, but also the beginning. That numbness I had carried started to shift into something sharper. Resolve. A woman does not reach 68 without learning how to survive storms. I had weathered many. Loss, scarcity, illness. I knew what it was to endure, but I also knew what it was to rebuild. And why should this storm be any different? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Vanessa thought my silence meant weakness. Charles thought my endurance meant blindness. They were both wrong. Silence is not surrender. It is preparation. Endurance is not blindness. It is strength. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply that night. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because I had chosen something beyond pain. I had chosen myself. The next morning, I dressed carefully, not in the drab cardigans Vanessa mocked, but in a blouse I loved, silk with soft pearl buttons I had saved for special occasions. I brushed my hair until it shone. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I didn't see an old woman too frail for romance. I saw someone who had survived, who still stood tall. That day, I didn't serve coffee to Charles. I made a single cup for myself, sat at the table, and drank it slowly while he rushed out the door without so much as a goodbye. And for the first time, his indifference did not gut me. It steeled me. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. I was preparing. By the time the sun set that evening, my grief had transformed into something sturdier, something that hummed beneath my ribs like a quiet anthem. I would not fade into the background of my own life. Not anymore. If silence unsettles, then Vanessa mistook mine for surrender. With each passing week, she grew bolder. It began in small, deliberate gestures. A hand on Charles's shoulder at the dinner table, fingers lingering a beat too long. A peal of laughter at one of his half-hearted jokes, her head tipped back, her arm brushing his. The way she leaned in when he spoke, as if he were the only man in the room worth listening to. She made no attempt to hide it, not anymore. At family gatherings, she would parade herself like a peacock. Tight dresses, lipstick too red for the occasion, her perfume a cloud that reached me before she did. She'd walk around my living room as though it belonged to her, dropping little comments meant to remind me of my place, or rather, of the place she believed I had lost. "Don't worry, Margaret," she'd say with that sly smile. "I'll take care of Charles. You just relax." Relax. The word dripped with mockery. Charles didn't exactly encourage her, but neither did he stop her. He seemed caught between shame and flattery, a man too weak to resist attention that should never have been offered. He laughed along when she teased me about being old-fashioned. He let her pour his wine, adjust his tie, fuss over him as though she were the mistress of the house. And with every gesture, my resolve only sharpened. I could feel the stakes rising like a tide around me. If I did nothing, I risked losing everything, my marriage, my dignity, even my home. Vanessa was clever. I could see her positioning herself, weaving a web where she became indispensable to Charles. It wasn't just about affection, it was about power. She flaunted it too. The expensive handbags she carried into my home, the jewelry that glittered on her wrists, most of them gifts from my husband, bought with accounts I had once carefully managed. She liked to place those bags casually on my sofa, her manicured nails drumming against the gold clasps, as if daring me to ask how much they cost. One afternoon, she walked into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. She set her handbag on the counter beside me, a glossy leather thing with a logo I recognized from magazines. "Isn't she beautiful?" she said, stroking it like a beloved pet. "Charles insisted I have it, said I deserved something special." She watched me then, eyes glittering, waiting for the sting to register. I smiled faintly, dried my hands, and said nothing. But inside, I was taking notes. Every bag, every bracelet, every careless display of entitlement went into the ledger of my mind. The contrast between us could not have been clearer. I had poured decades into loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet devotion. She had poured months into charm and manipulation. Yet in the eyes of my husband, her glitter seemed to outweigh my gold. But here is what Vanessa failed to see. Arrogance breeds blindness. She thought her victories were complete, that I had been pushed fully into the shadows. She thought my silence meant she was safe. She didn't know that I was watching, waiting, and planning. And Charles, poor Charles, believed he was the center of this attention, when in truth, he was just another pawn in her game. He was too dazzled to see it, too hungry for flattery to realize he was being played. I remember one evening in particular. She had prepared a dessert, store-bought though she pretended otherwise, and served it at the table. As Charles praised her culinary skills, she turned to me with a smile sweet as syrup. "Don't you think it's nice that I can handle the kitchen sometimes, Margaret? You've done enough over the years. Maybe it's time you let someone else take care of things." It was bold, brazen. A declaration, really. I nodded, folded my napkin neatly, and excused myself from the table. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the weight of her arrogance press down. But instead of crushing me, it solidified me. This was no longer about insult or humiliation. This was about survival, of my dignity, of my place, of the truth. If I allowed her to keep rising unchecked, she would consume everything I had built. My silence was no longer just endurance. It was strategy. I would let her believe she was winning, let her build her tower of arrogance brick by brick. Because when the time came, I intended to pull out the stone at its base. And I wanted that fall to be spectacular. Revenge, if you can call it that, never came to me in fire or fury. It arrived in silence, in the patient tick of the clock as I laid one careful brick after another. The first step was clarity. I needed to know exactly where I stood. One morning, while Charles and Vanessa were out on an errand, I opened the filing cabinet he thought I never touched. Decades of paperwork sat in neat folders, most organized by my own hand years earlier. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance records. It was all there, waiting. And just as I suspected, recent withdrawals had been made without my knowledge. Transfers to accounts that weren't ours, purchases that matched the very handbags and jewels Vanessa flaunted. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stacked the papers in order and slipped them into a new folder marked Evidence. The next step was counsel. I found a lawyer. Not the one Charles had used for years, but a woman recommended quietly by a friend at church. She was sharp, practical, and best of all, discreet. Over tea in her office, I laid out everything, the texts I had seen, the receipts I had gathered, the way my husband and his daughter-in-law had paraded their betrayal under my roof. She listened without pity, only precision. "You have more power than you realize," she said, tapping her pen against the folder. "The house is in both your names. His retirement accounts are marital property. And as for her, if she's living here without paying a cent, you can file eviction papers. She has no legal claim." Those words steadied me like a hand on my back. For so long I had felt cornered, but now I saw doors opening. At home, I began reclaiming what was mine in small, deliberate acts. Vanessa's designer handbags, those symbols of her, arrogance, became my first move. When she wasn't around, I gathered them one by one, photographed them carefully, and listed them online. I knew their worth. She had bragged about it often enough. Within weeks, each was sold to eager buyers, the cash quietly tucked into my own account. With that money, I booked something I had never dared to before, a solo cruise, a cabin with a view of the ocean, 2 weeks away from all of them. My secret, my declaration. I wasn't too old for romance. I was reclaiming it even if the romance was with myself. Meanwhile, the lawyer prepared the paperwork. Divorce documents drafted and ready, eviction papers with Vanessa's name printed in bold letters. Every line of ink felt like a thread in the net I was weaving. And still, I remained silent. At dinners, I smiled politely while Vanessa preened. When Charles chuckled at her jokes, I folded my napkin and excused myself early. They thought I was withdrawing further into irrelevance. They thought the game was theirs alone. But silence is deceptive. It hides the ticking of gears. I confided in no one but my lawyer and a single trusted friend, an old colleague who had weathered her own storm years before. "Keep your cards close," she advised. "They're blind to you now. Use it." So I did. I stopped pouring Charles's coffee in the mornings. I stopped setting aside Vanessa's favorite tea when she visited. Small omissions, subtle, but each one a reminder to myself. I was no longer serving them. I was serving my own future. And the best part? They didn't notice. Vanessa was too wrapped in her triumph, too busy parading her gifts and clinging to Charles's arm. He was too lost in her attention, too flattered by her laughter. Neither saw the storm clouds gathering just beyond their horizon. Each evening, after the house settled into its shallow silence, I would sit at my desk and review the papers. Proof of betrayal, proof of arrogance, proof of my resolve. I thought of all the years I had swallowed insults, endured slights, and sacrificed myself in the name of family. I thought of the night Vanessa told me I was too old for romance, and with every signature, every notarized stamp, I built my answer. This was not rage. This was not vengeance. This was strategy, careful, patient, unshakable. They thought I was powerless, but soon, very soon, they would learn that I had been preparing for the moment when their tower of arrogance would come crashing down, and I would be the one holding the final stone. The night of reckoning came quietly, disguised as an ordinary evening. Vanessa had gone out to dinner with Charles. Again. I didn't ask where. I didn't care to know. I only sat at the dining table, papers stacked neatly in front of me, my posture calm, my face unreadable. The house was still, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Each tick felt like a drumbeat, steadying me for what was to come. When the door opened, laughter spilled. Inside. Her laugh, high and sharp, followed by Charles's softer chuckle. They stepped into the room together, coats half off, Vanessa's lipstick slightly smudged. She stopped short when she saw me waiting. "Still awake?" she asked, her voice laced with mockery. "I thought you'd be in bed by now." I didn't answer her. Instead, I tapped the folder in front of me. Charles frowned, the first flicker of unease crossing his face. "What's this?" he asked. "Sit down," I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle, but it left no room for refusal. Vanessa smirked, dropping her handbag onto the chair beside her. "This should be good," she murmured, settling in with an air of arrogance. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, and laid out the first set of papers: copies of bank transfers, receipts for jewelry, photographs of the handbags she had paraded around my living room. Charles's face drained of color. Vanessa leaned forward, her smile faltering. "These," I said, tapping the papers, "are the purchases you've both made behind my back. I know exactly how much of our money has been funneled into your little games." Charles opened his mouth, closed it again. No excuse came. Vanessa recovered first. She laughed, though it sounded brittle. So what? Maybe Charles wanted to spend on me. Maybe he needed a little excitement. You can't blame him for that, can you? She stopped herself, but the word hung there, unsaid. Old. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on hers. "Go on," I said softly. "Finish your thought." She shifted, suddenly less comfortable. "You know what I mean?" "Yes," I said. "I do. I've heard it before." Her smirk faltered completely when I pulled out the next document, the eviction notice. I slid it across the table toward her. "You'll recognize your name on this. You've been living in my home without paying a cent. That ends now. You have 30 days to leave." Her eyes widened, outrage flooding her face. "You can't." "I can," I interrupted, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "And I already have." Charles slammed his hand on the table. "Margaret, this is madness." "No, Charles," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. "What's madness is believing I would sit quietly while you made a fool of me under my own roof." He flinched, his mouth working soundlessly. And then I laid down the final set of papers, the divorce documents. The sound of the folder hitting the table echoed through the room like a gavel. Vanessa stared at the word divorce printed in bold. Charles's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging. "This is done," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "The money, the betrayal, the lies. I won't carry them any longer. I gave you decades, Charles. I won't give you the rest of my life." The room fell into a charged silence. Vanessa shifted in her seat, eyes darting between us. Her usual confidence had deserted her. Finally, she tried to salvage her pride. "You think this makes you strong?" she hissed. "You're pathetic. You'll be alone." I stood, gathering the papers, and leaned close enough for her to see the steadiness in my gaze. "Too old for romance?" I said, my voice low and cutting. "No, too wise to waste it on fools." Her mouth snapped shut. Charles buried his face in his hands, and I, calm, unshaken, walked away, leaving them both sitting in the ruins of their arrogance. That was the moment the balance shifted. The silence I had carried for so long exploded into action, and they never saw it coming. The morning after the showdown, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet, heavy with the residue of what had unfolded. Charles hadn't come to bed. Vanessa hadn't dared to appear. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own home. I made myself a cup of tea, carried it to the porch, and sat watching the first light stretch across the garden. The roses were still bare, their branches stark against the pale sky, but I knew what was coming. Spring always returns, no matter how brutal the winter. A week later, I boarded the ship. The cruise was everything I had dreamed it might be. Endless skies, the ocean stretching wide and merciless, strangers who asked nothing of me except to share a smile or a laugh over dinner. I walked the decks at sunrise, feeling the salt wind whip through my hair. I sat alone at a table with a book and a glass of wine, savoring the peace of not having to perform for anyone. And in the evenings, when music drifted from the ballroom, I sometimes allowed myself to dance, not with a partner, but by myself, moving slowly, reclaiming rhythm I thought I'd lost. It was there, under the wide dome of sky and sea, that I realized what freedom truly feels like. The papers had been filed. The process would take time, but it was already in motion. Vanessa's eviction notice had been served. Her arrogance had cracked the moment she realized she no longer had a foothold in my home. Charles had retreated into silence, stripped of the power he thought he wielded. And me? I was lighter, stronger. I thought back to the insult that started it all. "You're too old for romance." How naive, how small those words seemed now. Romance is not bound by youth. Romance is a flame that belongs to anyone brave enough to carry it. Sometimes, yes, it is shared with another. But sometimes, gloriously, it is directed inward toward the self. On the deck of that ship, watching the horizon glow pink with dawn, I felt more alive than I had in years. I wasn't too old. I was finally wise enough to see that love begins with choosing myself. When I returned home, the house felt different. Not haunted, not oppressive. It was mine again. Each room breathed easier without her perfume clinging to the curtains, without his guilty laughter echoing down the hall. I opened the windows, let the fresh air sweep through, and set fresh flowers in a vase on the table. Neighbors stopped by with curious smiles, whispering questions. I didn't offer details, only a smile of my own. "Things change," I said, "and so do we." At night, I no longer lay awake in silence beside a man turned away from me. I stretched out across the bed, claimed the space, and slept soundly. My dreams were no longer crowded with betrayal. They were open fields, vast oceans, new beginnings. I had spent decades defining myself as wife, mother, hostess, caretaker. Now at 68, I was learning the beauty of defining myself as simply me. Some might call it loneliness, but I call it clarity. And clarity is a gift earned only with time. So when I think back to that smirk on Vanessa's lips, to her claim that romance belonged only to the young, I no longer feel anger. I feel pity. Because one day she too will discover that age does not steal romance. It refines it. And to anyone listening, especially those who have been told they are too old for something, too old for love, too old for change, too old for dreams, I ask you this. What if our age is not a cage, but a key? A key to freedom, a key to peace, a key to finally choosing ourselves without apology. That is the lesson I carry now. That is the gift of betrayal turned into liberation. Too old for romance? No. I am just old enough to know what real romance looks like. Dignity, self-respect, and the courage to walk away when love becomes poison. And with that, I step into my new life, not as a relic of the past, but as a woman unbroken, unafraid, and free. That wraps the full story arc, from shock and slights, through betrayal, breaking point, strategy, confrontation, and finally dignity and freedom.